Welcome to the podcast. It's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist. The Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm here with my longtime, man, you've been like my wingman for a long time on this, Chad. It's exciting. Here with our head coach, Chad Zimmerman.
Hi, everybody.
This is episode 323. Crazy. And we also have with us Cliff, not Cliff Burr. Yes, Cliff Pro Teams, Sofía Gomez Villafañe. How you doing, Sofia?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to have you on here. If anybody sees on YouTube, you can join us, by the way, every Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you totally should. You'll get content that makes you faster. And you could also see at some point, we might see like a bleached haired emo kid walking behind you named Keegan too at some point. So we're talking about elevation today, and he was very concerned that I would not mention the fact that elevation is indeed not real, according to him. So he may end up.
That's what all the science says. So he's pretty on the mark.
I was going to say, Chad, you've done hours upon hours of research for this, so I'm sure you can opine on that one. So, okay. So a couple of details before we get going. Successful Athletes podcast. I've been recording with so many fantastic athletes lately. It's just so inspiring. We have the story of Jessica Brooks that was published this week, and Jessica, Fortune 400 VP, mom, and Masters National Crit Champion. Like, how impressive. So honestly, not unlike you, Sofia, you're an Olympian, but you also work and you run a lot of what goes on at Ritual Chocolate. You do a huge amount of work with that, balancing pro life and career. Can I ask you really quick on that? Like, how do you do that? Because you can work remotely, but most of the racers you are racing at the pointy end of the fields, they don't have that sort of a demanding job as well.
Yeah, I think I've been with Ritual now for 5 years, and I'm their oldest employee, and I started as a barista, and I slowly kind of worked my way up into the office. And then as I started to show that I was really good at what I do, that I could also do it remote and just be more efficient. And the owners, Robbie and Anna, are huge cyclists, so they totally understand what it takes for me to achieve my dreams. And they also see that I'm really efficient at how I do it, how I do everything I'm supposed to do. So it kind of works for me because I get to do a lot of the work remote, but then it also works for them because they're paying me for, half the amount of time that it would take somebody else to do all the tasks. And I just have such a good understanding of the company. And I've definitely have been really lucky to set up my job that I work the hours I want, when I want. I kind of choose the workload that I get. Like, I choose the projects. I kind of choose what I exactly want to do for them. So I'm really thankful. And now that we have health insurance, it's even more of a bonus. So really lucky that even working part-time, they're offering health insurance for me. So it's a huge benefit, and it definitely helps me keep my life a lot more balanced.
Yeah, no doubt.
Sofia, can I ask a related, sort of related question? Is who handles the marketing things that make it into the subscription boxes?
I do.
Oh man, you were very good at it, because this month they included, and I'm very happy to plug Ritual Chocolate in a general sense, but their subscription boxes are super fun because not only do you get their amazing chocolate, which is just incomparable, but you get fun things every month. And this month, this last one was a pint glass. It's one of those can-shaped pint glasses, and it's the logo on it is in gold. Either way, it's just very cool. And every time I open one of those, it's just like a miniature or a minor Christmas morning sort of affair.
Yeah. You do a great job with it.
Yeah, it's really fun because it's a balance of, I want to create an experience, and then it's a balance of like, are you getting too much chocolate? Not enough. And obviously any small other vendors we can support is great. But this month we are testing on our subscribers our future trail mix that we're going to launch hopefully next year. So we'll be asking for feedback in next month.
That's awesome.
Cool.
To clarify, the Ritual, we aren't sponsored by anybody, but we like it's a big part of what Sofia does. So it's cool to talk about that. And then also it is cool to support cyclist-owned companies. It's really, really cool. So Yeah, exciting stuff. I still have the tasting panel that you sent, and which is really fun. It's like a tasting flight of different drinking chocolates, and you have to guess where they're from. And you have like note cue sheets and stuff to be able to run through. And whenever we have guests over, we like usually end up doing that because it's a novel experience for them and they love it. So it's fun. It's good stuff. So
thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thank you for being awesome, Sofia. Also want to update everybody. We've mentioned this before, but adaptive training, it's an open beta. So that means if you have wanted to use adaptive training, you can do it right now. You just opt in to the beta. It's not in production, meaning that there might be some bugs that you encounter. We're still working on things as well, always constantly improving, but you can try it out now. And oh my goodness, the data is overwhelmingly positive about how it improves people's training. It's really exciting. So go check it out, TrainerRoad.com/AT. Sofia, BWR or Belgian Waffle Ride, Asheville, North Carolina. The Belgian Waffle Ride experience expanded out of San Diego. They have a lot of different locations now. And Asheville is one of them. You aren't really a gravel racer, but at this point, I feel like we have to like recognize the fact that you're darn good at it. You won Crusher and the Tusher this year. And then you also, so you did Steamboat Gravel. Day didn't go like you wanted it to, but then at BWR Asheville, you won. Can you give us like the kind of like the focused race recap like we do in the sense of what did you do well and what didn't you do well at that event?
Yeah, BWR Asheville was cool. It was the first time we were racing it. It was supposed to start at the Sierra Nevada brewery that they have in Asheville, but because of COVID, they had to move it a little bit outside. So we were in this like mountain bike park in the middle of this little mountain. So it was like super, it like felt like you were at summer camp. It was really cool. But yeah, BWR and most gravel races are mass start. So it was obviously important to be near the front at the very beginning or just even at the start line, just because the roads were super small and it was a little bit chaotic. And really now that, it's a big hot topic, gravel racing and women's racing specifically, that we're racing with the men, like for me, it was the first climb that was 30 minutes in. It was, 20 something, maybe a 30-minute climb. And
wow. Right off the gun, basically.
Basically, yeah, which is really nice because it creates a lot of selection and it splits up the field. And the more the field is split, the safer it is.
You say it's very nice. I'm sure there were a lot of athletes not saying it's very nice. So
yes, yeah. and it helped that it was a gravel climb because I think it's pretty interesting to see the amount of people that come from a road background really struggle when it's no longer pavement under their tires. So it creates a little bit more of like a fun, you got to pick your lines and it started at the bottom of that climb third. Flavia and Tiffany Cromwell were both ahead. And then I just kind of slowly picked them up. And as we were getting near the top of the climb, I made a little gap onto Flavia and it meant that I was able to make a selection further up. So I was in selection number 2 and I think she ended up being in 3. And Tiffany was maybe in 4 or 5. And when I mean selections, it's just like these little groups that kind of form on the road. And there was a few times I got dropped from that group and I had to chase back on. So I definitely earned my right to be there. But then it gets to a point that I'm no longer racing the women. I'm just racing the men. So, and it's all fun and games until I found myself alone in the last 2 climbs because there was a big puddle. I went left, everybody went right. It was super soft. And I kind of lost my little group of 4 guys. And, it's all fun and games when you're with a group, but then the moment you're off the front and you're by yourself and you're like, oh my goodness, my competitors are probably in a group of 5, 10, maybe 15 men behind me. Like they're going to put in a lot of time into me without doing little work as I am off the front by myself doing, trying to hold 230 watts up every climb. And luckily I got caught by some guys and was able to kind of work with them. But yeah, gravel racing is interesting. It's not, especially in the women's race, I don't think it's a women's race. And, this afternoon, there's a really big Zoom call with all the gravel women to kind of talk about the state of the sport and kind of what we feel is fair. How would we, pitch it to race promoters on how we think a race should be ran, or at least, how can the women's race be a women's race? So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation and very productive conversation with all the girls. And I just want to win a gravel race knowing I was the strongest girl and I didn't need no guy, helping me go fast. So.
Yeah. Good job.
Was
it like, how different is it racing something like that compared to racing a mountain bike race for you in terms of like fitness? Is it like a totally different experience than what you usually have when you're mountain bike racing?
I think the first hour is like you're racing a short cross country race, just because you are having to go above threshold and try to make it above every little hill and do a 350 watt acceleration to kind of make those selections. But then you kind of settle in a group, and then you're just sitting, upper zone 2 tempo, maybe a little bit threshold when you're kind of pulling through. And then the race really comes alive in the last hour, maybe 90 minutes. I think that's when the race really happens. And it's either when your fatigue starts to set in, and if your hydration wasn't on point, where you start to suffer, or when, if you were in a group of 10 and your competitors were in a group of 30, like they're way more fresh than you are. So I think it's really different, but it's really fun too. It's like a really long group ride. And, I've raced, or it's not a race because it's a group ride in Tucson, like the shootout. And I have so much fun trying to make that a selection with all like one of the fastest guys in the nation. And I feel like gravel racing is just a 5 to 6 hour version of the shootout. So I think it's fun. I think there's definitely some changes that need to happen just so women can race women. But I have a lot of fun. It's tactical. It's fast. It's good to show the men kind of how strong we are. I think that's a huge advantage. But yeah.
Talk about the good prep for that too, being the shootout. You have like Sam Long, Ben Hoffman, if you, for the cyclists that are listening that may not know, two absolute, incredible athletes on the triathlon side. And then you have a bunch of pro cyclists, pro mountain bikers. You have like a crazy mix. Like it's not uncommon to have multiple national champions in that group, and you're holding with them. So that's really good. It's proper practice right there. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's fun because there's halfway through, there's a part called a bridge, because it's really a 45-minute segment, 1 to 3% slight incline. But there's one little part halfway through that you cross a bridge and it kind of pitches up. And Keegan always makes it his point to make it as hard as possible so I get dropped,
like a great boyfriend. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, for me, it ends up being good training because, if I make that selection, I know I'm riding good. But yeah, you definitely have to be comfortable with the pack and have to have good skills and good fitness. And yeah, I think gravel racing is cool. I had way more fun than I thought I would, for sure.
Nice. That's awesome. It's a good way for you to be able to do a lot of different things too with your skills as a pro bike racer. It's got to be fun to do something different than just, the same sort of races all the time. So, yeah. All right. Can we talk about Cape Epic a little bit here? So with you, we actually have a question from Joe. And he says, I rode in my first stage race this year, the Oregon Trail Gravel Grinder. I did about 400 TSS in the week or per week in training. So leading into this, my fitness was okay, but my body wasn't nearly as durable enough to make this fun. I made it to the finish, but it wasn't easy. So after this experience, it has me wondering about the TR gang and Cape Epic and how all of you are working on your, and he says in quotes, biological durability. So I think that he's talking about all the rest of us holding together and everything between arms and wrists and hands and all the different fatigue and skin. They can get blisters, all that stuff. Chad, why don't we start with you? You kind of did a prep event, so to speak, for this, since you're up pretty close to Montana these days.
I've done a couple things in preparation for Cape Epic. Two things in particular. One was kind of a mini camp. And if you're in North America, especially Pacific Northwest right now, you're well aware of the fact that we're completely blanketed in smoke. And some days the air index or air quality index goes crazy high. Like you don't even want to be out in your front yard, let alone huffing and puffing on the trail. So all of this ended up being indoors, and that was okay because it was extremely time efficient. And all I did was 7 days in a row of sweet spot work. Basically, what I wanted to capture was, what I'm going to face at Cape Epic is going to be a lot of sweet spot and below, right? So sweet spot probably, I hoped being the high end of things. So they were just 90-minute workouts, which all included 60 minutes of sweet spot. And I did that 7 days in a row. And the idea being to carry just a little more fatigue into each subsequent day. And that's exactly how it panned out. What was virtually the same workout on day 7 as day 1, was noticeably tougher to get through because of fatigue. And it wasn't enormous fatigue. So, I mean, what amounted to a 700 TSS week sounds like a lot, but based on how much riding I've been doing outdoors, it was very much in line with what I'm capable of. Then I took a few days off and I carried that into what was going to basically round off that training block, which was a ride in Whitefish, Montana, put on by Jess Sarah and Sam Boardman, called the Last Best Ride. And it was a gravel race as well, and perfectly in line with, everything I want to accomplish and everything I probably will experience at Cape Epic. And they offered a short course, which was in the ballpark of, I think it's 47 miles, a long course, 90 miles. And John Peachel, a friend of the podcast, had invited me to do this. Canadian borders didn't open. I'm making this way too long a story. He couldn't make it down. So I just did it on my own because, it's still good training and it's on the heels of a big training block. And I just kind of wanted to cap that off. But what happened was I exacerbated an existing injury that I've been dealing with since about April to a point where it started to inflict a new injury on me, and my pelvis is all out of whack. So come race day, and this started to hit me prior to, I was getting less and less mobility in my pelvis. So just moving my legs was hard. Walking was legit hard. Get these blinding little jolts of pain that kind of take your breath away. But I found that if I could just get my leg over the bike, once I'm on the bike and I could weight my hands, pretty good. So I went ahead and did the race.
This sounds like ideal preparation for Cape Epic.
Yeah. Well, there were a couple of things working against me. I went with 2 small tires. I was lazy. I didn't want to change my tires out. So with 33s is a pretty abusive course, but I did make the call about 22 miles into what was going to be a 90-mile day that I'm going to do the short course because I'm falling apart. And my TFL injury, which is the pre-existing one, was lighting up to a point where it was very clear I wasn't going to be on the bike for much longer. And so basically I carried a couple injuries in and I carried a couple more severe injuries out. And it's been a long, tough week. So for all the things I got right, I got some pretty important ones wrong. And now Cape Epic is severely in question. I haven't been on the bike for 11 days now. I'm in physical therapy. Things aren't trending the direction you'd hope they would. So my Cape Epic prep is feeling at the moment all for naught.
Oh man, what a bummer. So you might be out. After speaking to Pete, he might be in a similar situation. So he might be out. Sofia, you are committed.
I'm in. Hell yeah.
Committed. I am
better
committed.
Be.
Yeah. And Brandon too. But the Joe's question has me worried for sure. Because of having done stage races in the past, like it's not. So like your fitness, yes. Like so I know Sofia, you want to win, right? For Brandon and I for the like a dual male group, we won't win. Like we won't top 15. Like it would be so hard for us to do that. It's just really, really stacked field. So for us, we aren't necessarily targeting a win. I definitely have the fitness to finish, like that box is checked, but his question is a really good one. That's the sort of stuff that ends up putting a race like this in being compromised. Kind of like what you mentioned, Chad, like a TFL injury. It's not the fitness that might hold you back. It's that, or it's single track 6. I got really bad blisters on my hands, and those blisters made me hold my bars differently, which when I was holding my bars differently compromised my ability to handle my bike. I think I can't even remember because it was such a bad crash. Right. So like it's that sort of physical durability that is definitely worth considering. Are you concerned about that at all, Sofia? I mean, you train so much and you spend so much time on the bike compared to us, so you may not be worried about it.
Yeah, I think the main thing I'm more concerned about is, if you crash, how bad is it? I've heard that it's probably a good idea to have a pair of shoes that's half size bigger, because by the end your feet start to swell and you kind of want a little bit bigger of a shoe. But I think, I do so much strength training nowadays, and I have been putting in a boatload of work, not only before the Olympics, but also after. And currently right now, I'm kind of in my last, prep. It's going to be the biggest thing I've done in terms of hours. And I think my biggest concern is how Nate and I are going to keep each other in check to make sure that collectively we're being as fast as we can without sacrificing a future performance, or having him be so red line that he's dying. And he's Joe says, I made it to the finish, but it wasn't easy. And my thought, it's never easy. It's always hard, and either you do it in a longer amount of time or a shorter amount of time. Like the effort is still hard. It's just how long is it going to take you? And I think one of the coolest things about stage races, I did one in Israel with my really good friend, Rose Grant. And those days were some of the hardest days we had ever done. And we were like, we cannot do this by ourselves. If we were solo racing this, there is no way we could get this done. But when you have a buddy and you have someone there that's racing with you, talking you through, giving you motivation and feedback, and like, okay, you're a little cracked, I'm going to ride up to the feed zone and like fill up our water bottles, or let me take your extra water bottle because you're suffering on this climb, like let me take on the extra weight. I think that makes it a lot more easier. And then also, we are going to be on a mountain bike. So we are going to have suspension, where the Oregon Trail gravel grinder, you wear at the end of the day on a rigid bike. Even if you have, a diverge with a future shock, it's not real suspension. So I think the fact that we're on mountain bikes will be a little bit easier on our bodies. And you get to recover a lot more, I think, on the mountain bike. But yeah, I'm not too worried, but we'll see.
Yeah. I'm concerned about this very thing after doing. So I had plans to do a big training block, much like Chad had plans, and smoke, just like in Chad's situation, stopped us from doing it. We had one clear day, and I had planned to do routes that very closely emulated stages 3 through 8 of Cape Epic, or basically stages 3 through 7, but days, whatever, through whatever. But I was planning on doing that to kind of give myself a taste of like, all right, what does your body start to feel like? What are the adjustments you have to make? And most importantly, how is your nutrition plan going to work on a day in, day out sort of basis? I didn't get to test that. It was so smoky that I couldn't even ride inside with like multiple air purifiers that week. It was still too high, even in the house. So, but that one day, so I went out and emulated the Queen stage, and it was like 60 miles and 9,500 feet of climbing. And I know that Cape Epic is predominantly like 2-track and fire road. And this was almost all single track. So I know that's different, but I've also heard that Cape Epic is relentlessly bumpy. Like it's always just constantly not smooth. So, and that's the sort of thing, those small little frequent impacts that really start to wear your hands down or cause that sort of fatigue. And I know that's what you faced in Israel too, Sofia. I've heard that was really rough, just bumpy terrain that you're always dealing with. So you're used to that. But at the end of that, because I've had to ride inside so much because of the smoke, I've kind of gotten soft. Like I'm putting in the time, but the physical part of me, and I'm doing strength training and doing everything else, but riding a mountain bike is a specific application of strength. And when you don't do it for a really long time, you start to feel it, like when you get back on that bike. And at the end of that ride, I was really feeling it. My hands, wrists, arms, right? Even my skin on my hands was pretty rough. So that caused quite a lot of concern for me because I don't want the same thing to happen that happened at single track 6, that the skin on my hands was like literally the thing that was causing the greatest barrier. So I thought, man, I need to do more days at North Star, because when you ride at North Star, you get this concentrated like interval session of descending where you get to ride on these really rough trails that, man, they toughen your hands up real fast. But North Star closed down because of smoke. So can't use that. So then the other side of me is like, okay, like I guess just try to ride without gloves when I ride my mountain bike, and hopefully my hands get tougher. And then the other side of me is also thinking like, indulge in yard work that tears your hands apart. I don't know. So I'm trying to think of like all these things that I can do, because I can't ride my mountain bike outside because the fires that we're enduring in our area, because that's a big concern of mine. And it's a big concern of mine. We'll do a podcast before we do this, but it's a big concern of mine for all of us that are doing it, that like, it'd be such a shame that like a small thing gets in the way, right? Like that would be a bummer. So,
and that's kind of in line with, I mean, I have this injury and, you know, there's really three concerns. Is it going to heal in time for me to be able to go? In the meantime, I'm not training. That's certainly not helpful. And then at what point over the course of, you know, the prologue's short, but then there's 7 long days following, I think is pretty unrealistic considering how close we are to the event. But if I can just step back a bit to what Sofia commented on when Joe said he made it to the finish, but it wasn't easy. She said it's never easy. It's hard. I actually have a fresh perspective to offer, because when you sign up for a 90-mile event and about 25 miles in, you decide you're going to do the 50-mile event, it actually is pretty easy because you've been pacing for a very long day. You're nourished for a very long day, assuming you did it right. And then suddenly it's like, oh, someone just lopped 40 miles off of this ride. Things actually got pretty fun for that remaining 25 miles, all things considered.
I don't think we'll have
and I know that
routes at Cape Epic.
No, it's absolutely does not apply to Cape Epic. I recognize that.
Yeah.
But, you know, it almost makes me wonder why you wouldn't always just sign up for the long course. So you get the early start and then you go out there and you just decide on the fly, you know what, I'm going to do the short course, assuming you're not competing.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. I'm really excited for it though. Like I didn't anticipate being this excited because this definitely isn't like in the wheelhouse of where I find my most enjoyment with mountain biking, but I am like fully in, like the head's fully locked in. I'm excited for it. I can't wait. Brandon, my teammate's in great form. His descending is fantastic. Like, I think we're going to have a great time. It might be a little bit easier for him because he's so darn fast going uphill, but I think that we'll work together really well too. So we don't even call each other Jonathan and Brandon anymore. It's always teammate. We meet multiple times a day. We're like virtual fist bumping. It's on. It's a good duo. So I'm excited for it.
For you guys. I'm very happy for you.
Yeah. And Chad, well, our fingers are crossed. I'm sure all the listeners listening right now. For those of us that are joining us on YouTube as well, you can join in and ask live questions, and we'll have hopefully some time to be able to answer those at the end. But let's get into the deep dive, Chad. Let's talk about altitude. This question comes from Andrew. He says, hello, TrainerRoad coaches. My wife and I are amateur endurance athletes with a certain amount of disposable income. We live in Iowa with an altitude of a whopping 850 feet above sea level. I hear about the use of altitude tents at home, and it seems like they are a means to improve performance without a downside, except being the cost of the altitude tent. The concept is that we would use the tent consistently during sleep, about 8 hours a day, and train at our 850 feet of elevation. So sleep high and train low. He says, are there downsides to using a tent consistently? Are there other things we should be spending our money on? Is sleep quality impacted either short-term or long-term? And how much of a performance gain can be expected? Finally, he says, are there other effects that we should be considering? Thanks for the great material and products. And we're going to ask quite a few questions on altitude. We grouped a few of them that all of you have submitted at trainerroad.com/podcast. Any question you have, by the way, you can submit there. So Andrew's is the first one. And Andrew obviously has many questions, but we're going to cover other topics that pertain to altitude as well throughout this. So Chad, where do you want to start? This is more about altitude tents, but where do you want to start with this?
Yeah, so we are talking about tents here. So we're talking about simulated altitude training. But I think we need to understand the basics of altitude training before we move forward. And be it known, this is a topic that's very popular with researchers and athletes and coaches. So there's quite a lot of literature out there. I just started accumulating studies, and before I knew it, I had, I think, 26 that I touched to some degree. Some I really read top to bottom. Some I just, read the abstract and the conclusion. But there's, and that is probably just tip of the iceberg in terms of all the information that's out there. So with that grain of salt, realize that these are basics, and it's just some of the basics, just the basics that are relevant to what I hope to explain today. So in terms of altitude training basics, I want to cover three, what I feel are very important terms, and it's 2 types of pressure and then concentration. So we'll start with atmospheric pressure, which is also referred to as barometric pressure because it's measured with a barometer, and it's quite literally the weight of the Earth's atmosphere. So to put it another way, it's how much the air weighs. And this is commonly measured in millimeters of mercury, but I put things in for this portion of it, pounds per square inch, because, we all inflate our tires. Most of us look at the PSI. At sea level, the weight of the atmosphere is 14.7 PSI. And so this helps us quantify that when we move to 2,000 meters, 2,500 meters, which equates to roughly 6,600, 8,200 feet, that drops to 11.5. And then, the higher we get, down to 10.8. So pretty substantial drops in the weight of the air. And it's worth noting that temperature affects this too. And I linked to a calculator where you can kind of play around with this and geek out for a minute. It's kind of fun. But I did notice that when the altitude was at 0, the temperature didn't affect it. And I'm guessing the calculator is accurate and that's a real thing. So that's kind of an interesting side note. But the point is, the higher we go, the lower the atmospheric pressure becomes. Okay.
This is like with the context wrapped into this of PSI. Thanks for doing that, by the way, Chad, because that makes you realize when you look at 14.7 down to 11.5 or 10.8, we think of that in terms of tires. That's like the difference between properly inflated and a real squishy tire. But it's also, if you look at just the percentage decrease, it's a substantial percentage. We're almost looking at a third of drop in pressure when you go to 6,600 to 8,200 feet.
It's not nothing. It is significant. Yeah.
You can see it quite a bit too when you're like, I train in Tucson and then at home, and my ability on the flats to go faster here is higher because there's less of that pressure. And that's why, the guy that just set the 4K fastest time, they go to Aguas Calientes in Mexico. And it's kind of what they found when they first did the Olympics at elevation. It's like all these records that require you going through the air were smashed because you can travel easier because the air has like less resistance in it, which is really interesting.
And you feel that too. It's cool. Like time trialists, especially if you're training down at sea level and then you go up high, as long as it doesn't last so long that you start to recognize the adverse physical effects of elevation, boy, it feels so cool to just rip through the air like that, it's awesome. Super cool. Where do you want to go next with this, Chad?
Okay. So now let's talk partial pressure. So that's the atmospheric pressure and now partial pressure. So it is quite literally what it sounds like. It's part of the total pressure of all the gases in whatever volume of space. So for instance, oxygen is just one gas in the air that we breathe, and it exerts part of the total pressure in, let's say, an oxygen tent or an altitude tent or a nitrogen house or whatever it is. Now, changes in this pressure actually change how hemoglobin binds oxygen. If you recall, hemoglobin is the protein in our blood that clings to oxygen and delivers it to wherever it needs to go. So put that another way, it's hemoglobin's oxygen carrying capacity is affected. Now at sea level, the pressure of oxygen is apparently 160 millimoles of mercury, 160. I also saw 150 quite a lot, so I'm not sure, but the point is it's there. But what's necessary for hemoglobin to be completely saturated is only 100 millimeters. So we're well beyond that. Now, to kind of shed light on why this saturation is important, there's a study back from 1999 with Dempsey and Wagner, where they noted that each 1% decrease in blood saturation, so the less saturated your blood is, the less saturated the hemoglobin is, below 95%, say you're measuring with a little pulse oximeter on your fingertip, you'll suffer a 1 to 2% decrease in VO2 max. And how accurate those numbers are isn't really the point so much as that pressure falls, VO2 max goes with it. So the important link between these two pressures is that as atmospheric pressure falls, so do partial pressures. Okay. So all the pressures move hand in hand.
Is this why there's kind of like a sweet spot with elevation where down at sea level, you have excess pressure, you could say, and partial pressure, what we're talking about here. And then when you get to that somewhere, I think it's probably somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000 feet, right? And at that point, and I could be wrong there, but there's a point of diminishing returns where maybe you hit that inflection point of that 100 millimoles per whatever it was.
Or millimeters of mercury. Yeah. Yes, I think you might be a little high. I don't think it's 5,000. I think 5,000, the partial pressure of oxygen or the effective pressure, and we'll get to that, is a bit lower. So it's probably, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 feet. I don't know what it is, but I do think you're on the right track.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's why you kind of like, you want to get the thinner, faster air, like Sofia was saying, but you just don't want to cross that pressure threshold where you're actually not getting sufficient saturation of your blood.
Exactly.
Huh. Cool.
Okay, so third and final term, real short, is concentration. And of course, we're talking about gases here, and it's real simple in that it's the percentage of gas in the mixture. It's going to total 100%. So the concentration of oxygen at sea level is 20.93%. We're going to call it 21% from here, but that other 0.07% is actually the trace gases that are mixed in there, because the other 79% is actually nitrogen. So when we think we're inhaling, an oxygen-rich mixture of air, we're actually inhaling a nitrogen-rich. It's just the oxygen that we're concerned with. Okay, so with all this in mind, we have some understanding of barometric pressure, atmospheric pressure, partial pressure, and concentration of gases. Now let's talk about how, as we ascend, when the barometric pressure gradually decreases, so do the partial pressures. They go with it. The air actually gets, as we often put it, thinner. It's less dense. It is lighter. It weighs less. So what's important here is though the pressure changes, the concentration of gases does not. So oxygen concentration is still 21%. There's just less air. It's less dense. So the oxygen molecules are farther apart. And this lower density leads to a thing, and I'm not sure if this is commonly used or if it's just a marketing mechanism for a particular, I think it was Hypoxico. I linked to their PDF chart, and it's super interesting because you can see at different altitudes what is the effective oxygen percentage, even though it's 21%, but because it's less dense, here's what I'm actually breathing in. So for example, at Flagstaff, Arizona, which is one of those few places where live high, train low is actually possible, they're at 7,000 feet, which makes the effective oxygen percentage 17. So we dip down from that 21%, a full 4%, just because we've moved up to 7,000 feet. Wow. Take that to something like Leadville up at 10,000, and that's where Leadville is. That's not where the race stays, right? It ascends even higher than that. You're already working at 14.3%. So that's a substantial hit. I mean, that's what, 33%. It's a big dip in, the amount of air or oxygen you can get into your bloodstream. So at sea level, we experience the greatest pressure of oxygen on our blood, right? And hemoglobin binds more easily. There's a greater affinity. And once it makes it into the muscle, certain things happen that change that affinity so that it can actually impart that muscle or that oxygen to the muscle. That's a topic for another time. But the less pressure in the atmosphere, the higher up we go, the lower this effective oxygen percentage becomes. So hemoglobin becomes less saturated with oxygen. And I'm pretty sure we've covered this, but hemoglobin has 4 binding sites, so it can grab 4 molecules of oxygen. And as the pressure decreases, it may not bind all 4 of those. So in turn, oxygen in the blood is reduced. In turn, our aerobic capacity diminishes. In turn, our ability to recover also diminishes because that happens aerobically, as we've said numerous times. So moving forward, just understand that we can affect both pressure and concentration, and we can do it naturally or artificially. And with regards to artificially, we're talking about simulation, and this is what Andrew's question is about tents and houses and offices. Basically, they're hypoxicators where we can affect the level of oxygen in whatever the space is. And this is done, it's kind of a side note, but this is done via typically nitrogen dilution, if I understand it correctly, where they basically pump more nitrogen into the room, and that means a decrease. The nitrogen pressure goes up, some other pressure has to come down, and apparently that's oxygen. Now, when they do that, we achieve something that's called normobaric hypoxia. So the pressure stays the same, but the level of oxygen in the environment changes. So normal pressure, low oxygen concentration. And some papers, I came across a few, and the one I linked probably isn't the strongest argument in support of either, but some experts do claim that there's a difference whether or not you achieve your altitude adaptation from normobaric or hypobaric altitude exposure. And I'm not sure. I think it's pretty contentious. I didn't dig too deeply into it. So if you want to get after it.
That could almost make it's dangerous to assume because it makes logical sense, right? And that
it's not natural.
If you're just increasing the presence of nitrogen and thusly decreasing the presence of oxygen, that is different than altering the actual pressure overall of what you're dealing with, right?
But most of the sought after changes do still seem to happen. There's just these nuanced changes that seem to be a bit different. Whether or not they're important and whether or not they influence performance, I think is the contentious aspect of that whole argument.
This is also, this has me thinking about the common scenario that we've had posed. I don't know if you've ever thought of this too, Sofia, but it's kind of like, well, what if I could train in like hyper oxygenated environments, like where it's just like you're doused in that, so to speak, and there's a ton of it, and then catch me with an FTP of 400 watts, one day to the next, just because of that. But so I hear people talk about that a whole lot. On the other side, that point of excessive blood oxygen saturation that we have even down at sea level makes me call that whole concept into question. But I guess we'll talk about it more later. So
we'll actually talk about it later today.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, Chad, carry on. Sorry.
Okay. So the question before us is why would we want to, why train and or live at altitude, or why simulate it? And to put it very simply, endurance benefits. We're all pretty aware of this. So what are we after with these specific adaptations? Is chiefly we want an increase in the production of our endogenous EPO. So not to be confused with the recombinant EPO that's used in blood doping, but the stuff that's actually produced by our kidneys when we're faced with, in this case, an altitude challenge, thinner air. And what this does is it accelerates a process called erythropoiesis. So the
hardest
creation
word to say
of,
ever.
it's not, I just botched it, erythropoiesis. So we're trying to increase the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. So EPO released from the kidneys goes to the bone marrow, makes red blood cells or reticulocytes immature. You can measure those reticulocytes, see what sort of increase you expect in red blood cells down the line, blah, blah, blah. But this basically what we achieve when this happens is greater sea level VO2 max. So at sea level, VO2 max goes up. At altitude, it may not go up, but you're adapting so it doesn't take the same hit that it used to take. But in any case, the performance is an increase in your endurance performance. That's all we're after, right? And there are further hematological changes, so changes within the blood, and there are particular importance. And one of them is hemoglobin mass, because as I've just described, hemoglobin is what binds the oxygen. So more hemoglobin, more oxygen delivery, right? And it's up to the muscle to do what it can with that, but that's again another topic. And anytime we affect red blood cell mass without affecting plasma, which often happens at altitude, we're going to see changes in hematocrit, right? So packed cell volume goes up, plasma doesn't change, we get a bump in hematocrit. Whether or not that's relevant, it doesn't really matter. We want more red blood cells, we want more plasma. Who cares what happens to hematocrit, really? Okay, in this process, there are other proteins that are actually synthesized. And so this doesn't just affect, it really affects the whole body, and that's important to keep in mind. So we'll see changes in angiogenesis, so the formation of new blood vessels, vasodilation, which is pretty important considering we want the blood vessels to expand when we're pushing what could be thicker blood through them. Increases in glycolytic enzymes, so the anaerobic side of things, which shouldn't come as a surprise when you consider the fact that we're operating in an environment that provides less oxygen, less aerobic resources. So yes, our body's going to respond in a way that it still needs to do the work. So it's going to shift some of that importance toward the anaerobic side of things, increase those glycolytic enzymes. So there can be an improvement in your anaerobic work capacity as well. So with regards briefly to that hemoglobin mass study back in the early 90s noted that there's about a 1% increase for every week during exposure to altitude. And whether or not that number still holds true, whether that's been disproven or whatever, the fact is you're at altitude, hemoglobin mass continues to go up, up, up. Same thing kind of seems to hold true with red blood cell volume. And this was a study way back from 1959, where they noted that as long as you're still exposed to altitude, you might see an increase in your red blood cell volume for 6 to 8 months. So it just continues to climb, which I think is why some people think, why don't I just, sleep in my tent, spend as much time in my tent, if you have one, every day as much as possible. And it's a solid rationale. I honestly can't tell you why. Well, I'll suggest some reasons why you might not. Which brings us to.
Sorry, Sofia's smiling. I think she can't think of any reasons not to as well. It's just not fun.
We'll mention that. Yeah.
It's not exactly a nice place to be.
No, and that's a strong argument against it, or at least spending inordinate amounts of time in an altered environment. So this brings us to the challenges and the downsides of living in or simulating altitude. And I framed 4 challenges, and I'll follow it up with 4 or 5 solutions to them. But I think these are the questions most people want answers to. First off, the first challenge: training high limits our work capacity. News to no one. We know that when we go to altitude, the training stimulus we're hoping to achieve is dampened. We simply can't do it. And in turn, this is going to reduce the training adaptation that comes after. We're not eliciting the adaptation if we're not providing a sufficient stimulus. And what I think a lot of people miss is this is not just with regards to maximal efforts. It's not just, oh, I can't do my VO2 max repeats, so I'm not going to reap the benefits of that work. What about something like sweet spot, where you're supposed to be operating at 90% of your capacity, but your aerobic capacity is diminished, and now you're gutting it out trying to hold 80%. The body's not going to say, oh, this is enough. I recognize that you're struggling. I'm going to adapt anyway. No, it needs that 90% or the 92 or 94% in order to keep on adapting. So another challenge is there's an increased risk of overtraining and infection. So anytime we push into overtraining, infection, the risk of infection climbs. And this is for the simple reason that this is another stressor. So, and that in and of itself is worthy of concern, but we also need to recognize that additional stress can come at the expense of additional training stress. So if we're stressing ourselves in one way, it's going to be harder and harder to elevate the training load to achieve that necessary stimulus if part of our body is dealing with this new added stressor. Another challenge is that elites, and I might point out, I don't think I came across a single study that didn't either involve or was focused on elites, and for good reason, have demonstrated a need for a stronger stimulus. So they adapt. So they have to go to higher altitudes. They have to endure longer exposures. They have to endure repeated exposures. And this suggests a couple things. And one is that adaptation requires greater stimuli over time. Again, news to nobody. And secondly, that, and this is a bit more encouraging potentially, is that those sensitive to altitude might derive more of a stimulus more easily. So if you're a lowlander and you go to altitude and you fall apart, stands to reason that if you're a lowlander who falls apart and you go to altitude, the stimulus is there. The adaptation is beckoning. So here's hoping. And it's more conjecture than anything. I didn't find any research to back that up. Okay, fourth challenge is logistically challenging. It just is. And it doesn't matter if you're living or simulating. It's a hard thing to do. And it's especially hard in the light of the consensus on the requirements for the effective dose of altitude exposure. So this is the agreement across studies. And I looked at some 25 papers. Some of them were meta-analyses. Some were reviews. Most of it was summed up really nicely in Randall Wilbur's paper from 2007, where he said that the minimum altitude was 2,000 meters, which is about 6,600 feet. And then they put the sweet spot in the 2,000 to 2,500 meters, which is 6,600 to 8,200 feet. Said that a 4-week minimum is, well, 4 weeks is the minimum. I did read a number of papers that had 3 weeks at the low end of things. But the point is, we're talking a few weeks at a time, 22 hours a day. And he put the low end, or he didn't put, but other studies put the low end down to greater than 12 hours a day. That's still a lot of time that you have to do this for 3 weeks, 4 weeks on end. He did note in a later paper, Randall Wilbur, that when it comes to simulating altitude, 12 to 16 hours a day might actually be as sufficient in terms of achieving similar erythropoietic effects, but you have to do it at a higher altitude. So he shifted that sweet spot from up to 2,500 to 3,000 meters. So a 500 meter bump. And then all of them seem to agree pretty widely that some form of train low has to be incorporated. You can't do your training at altitude. You might be able to do some of it, but the stimulus has to be derived in an oxygen-rich environment.
Sophia, you mentioned that you train in Tucson, usually during the winters, right? And then you relocate up to Utah and you live up there. What sort of differences do you feel in terms of like a perception when you're doing your training, or do you have to drop your power down? How does that work?
Yeah, like I think in Tucson this year, my FTP was like 270. Probably got right at the end as I was leaving, closer to like 275. And then I come to sea level and it goes down to 250 or to altitude and it goes down to 250. And it's really hard mentally, especially when I'm doing all those accelerations and like VO2 work. Like at sea level, above 300 watts accelerations, no problem. Like I just have this idea that I have to be above 300 on all my accelerations, and I come here to sea level or altitude, and it's really, really hard. And I think it takes me about 4 weeks to start to feel better. I never feel great at altitude. Like I don't enjoy doing VO2 work at altitude. I think it's like should be illegal. But yeah, it takes me a month. But then, someone like Keegan, for example, who he grew up in Park City, and, because I have been in altitude since I was in college, on and off, but he's grown up at altitude and he comes here and he's able sometimes to produce higher power here than at sea level. And I think it goes back to that he's been at altitude for so long that he needs a way higher stimulus. So his baseline for altitude and where his FTP is able to change doesn't follow the ramp that most people would follow. So that's why he thinks altitude is not real. And I'm like, man, I'm like dying out here. Like it's not, it's not fun. But yeah, I think it's and everybody's different. And I think every year I come back, it gets a little bit easier, but it's still marginally easier. It's a lot of hard work for sure.
Sophia, I think you just touched on 5 good points that I'm going to make. So way to drive it home in advance of what I'm about to share with you. So with regards to these challenges, let's look at some solutions or at least some workarounds. So back to that first challenge where we note that training high limits your work capacity. Well, what we're talking about, train low. So live high, train low, train in an oxygen-rich environment at or near sea level, sleep and recover at altitude. And this is geographically challenging. That's recognized. There are some places where you can do it, but in most cases, it's not really on offer. So another possibility to this first challenge is to live high and train high, but train high with supplemental oxygen. And this is referred to as hyperoxic training. That's what Jonathan just touched on earlier. And these studies are old. I know they've done more recent ones, but there's something there. It's at least worth looking into. A 1985 study by Powers, they enriched the oxygen concentration to 26%, so about a 5% bump, and they used highly trained athletes. And they basically reduced the oxygen saturation down to 92%. And when they did so, they saw increases in VO2 max. Unfortunately, they couldn't get some athletes to plummet to that low oxygen saturation level. And they didn't respond. So a little bit of an issue there. But this study, it wasn't this study, it's probably other studies, used everything from 30% to 70% oxygen concentration. And it quite simply allowed greater performance, and in a lot of cases led to increased performance.
That's got to feel amazing too. Like just being in that environment.
Probably because a study just a few years later in 1993 by Chick and colleagues had athletes, I can't remember what the level of the athletes was, but they did 8x5 at 95% of their max workload. Did this for 4 weeks. And they were operating at an altitude of 1,600 meters. So basically 5,200 feet. So kind of Reno-ish, really. And they use 72% or 70% oxygen concentration, which is enormous. I mean, that's tons of oxygen, which, I mean, there's so many questions to be asked in that case. Like, I mean, can the muscle what does it even do with that much oxygen? How do you bind that much oxygen? I can't make sense of it. But what was interesting is that they couldn't do 10 minutes of this work. I mean, this is a 40-minute workout. I think they did a couple times a week, maybe 3 times a week over 4 weeks. Without the supplemental oxygen, they couldn't even do it for 10 minutes. Whoa. So that oxygen was absolutely necessary. And I really feel like placebo breaks down over the course of workout after workout, week after week. So there has to be something there.
Chad, can we dwell on this really quick? And I'm probably going to ask you questions that you don't know the answer to. So, but just the same, wouldn't that cause a significant toll on the muscle itself? I would think, like working at such a greater amount, producing much higher work than what it's used to.
Well, that's the point of it. And that's the stimulus that's the strong stimulus that they were hoping to achieve.
Yeah.
Question is,
but the soreness was crazy, like thereafter, I'm sure that you perhaps felt worked.
Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, if it's fueled well, these aren't high force contractions. They're not eccentric contractions. That's I don't even know that the muscle breakdown would be that big of a concern. Yeah, but I did link to both the studies if anyone wants to dig a little deeper. Unfortunately, when studies start to lapse into the 20, 30, 40 years old, they weren't performed with the same level of stringency that's required these days. So some of those details may not even be available.
I linked to those studies and all the studies you've mentioned so far in the live chat. We'll also put them into trainerroad.com/forum. Again, this is episode 323, so you can go through and find all the links to the studies that Chad's mentioning so far. This is like the most fascinating idea. I actually think I remember Nate mentioning that he participated in a similar study at UNR on a treadmill.
He probably did.
And he had a mask that was basically the mask itself was where the oxygen was being flowed into.
I'm pretty sure he did because Jeff Angerman, who's a local racer, he was a professional racer for a while, was heading that very experiment.
Yeah, because that's fascinating, because in a world, especially when athletes can train indoors, like that brings up this really cool concept of, I don't know into the future if this stuff would even be accessible in terms of cost, and even safe to have so much, large quantities of gases like this, at your disposal. But if you did, and when you were training indoors, you could do very targeted sessions.
Sure.
And in this, this hyperoxic environment, and then just absolutely run that and move the needle way up, right? With those workouts.
And the questions have been asked, are there alternatives too? And this is one of those alternatives, at least, potentially. Yeah.
And then VO2 wouldn't suck at altitude, Sophia, because you could just make up your own altitude.
That's the idea, right?
There is no altitude.
Yes. This is exactly Keegan's dream. Maybe he's already doing it. We don't know. Sorry, Chad, derailing you with my own musings.
Not
here,
at all.
So.
Nope. Yeah. So back to that second challenge, which, it considers that there's an increased risk of overtraining and infection. In this case, repeat altitude exposure. So they go more frequently, but they go shorter. And the people who stand behind this or have researched it and are finding that there may be something there, say that there's a clear superiority in that these shorter, more frequent exposures are a number of things, one of which is less fatiguing. They allow athletes to maintain a higher training quality over the time because they're not up there for as long. And, I totally lost my place. And it's just less disruptive. Yeah. Just consider that it in a general sense, you don't have to go for as long. You don't have to disrupt your normal day-to-day as long with these little training interventions. And it becomes really interesting. There's actually evidence of quicker acclimatization upon repeat ascents. So you do these short camps, and the next time you go up, you acclimatize a little more quickly. And they're using this term hypoxic memory, and it actually has a number of implications that they point out. One is that shorter duration camps can be equally effective as the long camps, assuming they're repeated more frequently. Non-responders are given an opportunity to eventually respond. So every time I see that term non-responder, it makes me cringe because I don't think that actually exists. I think it's just a matter of finding the dose that creates a response. But that aside, these people who are tough to gain a response from, Keegan might be a good example, need to repeat the camps such that they acclimatize more rapidly, spend more time acclimatizing further, I guess, so that eventually they do reap a benefit, that sought after benefit. And then another is, just that, a method to maximize the response in elite athletes. They go again and again and again. And this is what's commonly used in the really high level teams. I think more and more they're shifting toward shorter camps that are repeated more frequently. Sometimes they'll see 8 camps a year, whereas before it was like, I think typically 1 or 2 camps prior to something like a grand tour.
Yeah, it was more common to see in the off season, so to speak, or the base season, to do a big chunk at altitude and then maybe do one thing before a grand tour on the roadside. Yeah. But now, as you saw with, I'm thinking of Vanderpool in particular, I think that he did like 3 or 4 this year where he was up there for like a week and then, or, somewhere around a week to 2 weeks and then back down and repeat. So that's saying that basically an athlete that, so for us average athletes that probably don't have the chance to be able to just go up and stay at altitude for an extended period of time, but those that if we go up somewhat regularly and, a week at a time, something like that, then there can be at least it's not as if like, it's not purely cumulative in one block, right? You don't have to be there for the entire time to get the benefit. That's much more accessible for us athletes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's seems to be where things are veering. So I have a feeling a lot more research, it might be out there already, but if it isn't, it's going to start to crop up more and more. That third challenge we kind of covered with that one right there. So let's skip to the fourth one, which was that it's logistically challenging. So, simulate altitude. And I recognize that's not going to do away with all the logistical challenges that come with it. I mean, there's still things you have to do for so many hours a day, for so many days a week, for so many weeks in a row. It's still challenging, but at least you don't have to travel, right? So So now you simulate altitude, and this is what's termed normobaric. So the pressure is still the same. We're not hypobaric. We're not going up to lower pressure, lower oxygen. We're staying at normal pressure, lower oxygen. And this is basically what altitude houses or altitude tents do, is they decrease that oxygen concentration. So the pressure at the low altitude stays the same, but the percentage of oxygen is reduced. And, given that, assuming that they experience enough exposure to this hypoxic situation, eventually those adaptations take place.
But even living in a tent, that's a challenge in and of itself, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's still going to be disruptive to some degree. So you just have to decide, is this level of disruption something I can accommodate in hopes of achieving, well, I'd like to say a promised benefit, but it's not. So we're going to talk about a couple of those things right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, and for those that are wondering on the I guess how that works, now some tents are offering things that are basically like a head bubble, so to speak, that you can put over that kind of goes over your shoulders more or less. And then you can use that. You can do one that is more like a bivy, almost like a small, like a large sleeping bag, I guess I'd say. And then you can get one that covers like a whole tent, or like kind of like a drapes over to create a room. And I'm saying this in air quotes.
Yeah.
Or I guess theoretically you could probably seal your whole house and do it that way or something.
Your house, I've seen images of offices where they have their little workspace that's in a booth. So, you work 8 hours a day and you can simulate altitude in that space. And then you go home and you sleep in a tent. That's, potentially 16 hours a day.
Wow.
Which is within that range of what's recommended.
That's just a lot to go through, a lot of expense.
It absolutely is.
Sleeping really in that thing too, it's got to be really uncomfortable, which might compromise your sleep enough to actually kind of leave you not getting benefit.
Sleep's an interesting issue. We'll get to that briefly, but we will cover it. Okay, so let's talk about some not random, but disparate, going to come from a lot of different directions here, considerations concerning altitude adaptation. First of which is probably the most important, and that's endurance athletes already have the deck stacked favorably. So just because of the training we do, you can see 20 to 25%, and we don't need to get so hung up on that number, but greatly more red blood cell volume, hemoglobin mass, blood volume in a general sense. So, the red blood cells and the plasma, simply via training. So compared to untrained, we're already performing at a higher level. My point is that if your training hasn't already brought you up to a high level, aren't you putting the cart before the horse? You're going to chase altitude adaptations when you haven't even pushed your training to a point where you've achieved all that you can achieve just from training consistently, nourishing well, recovering properly, doing all the things that are very accessible and minimally disruptive, especially if they're part of your lifestyle already. So let me pose a question to you, Jonathan. I mean, you're a high level athlete as it is. Have you done any altitude training? I mean, without altitude training, do you still see room for growth in your performance capability?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, there's tons of room for growth, right? I think the only thing I've done that's close to altitude training is camping for a week up at like 500 feet. And during that week, when I was camping there, I put in a solid block of work where I was, putting in a lot of time for a week. Yep. And you know what? I don't know if it made me faster, but it absolutely made me really fatigued. Like it was exhausting, putting in big hours up where I'm staying. I think the lowest I got was 7,000 feet in elevation. So, and the highest was nearly 10. And just doing that, regularly every day, it was rough.
Sure.
I'm not sure. I've never done I think that one of the easiest spots to do like an extended camp at elevation relative for me, since I'm living at around 5,000 feet, my average training elevation is about 6,000 feet. And I apologize for all those that don't use Imperial. But it's to go to like Colorado or something like that, where the average elevation is just so high there that you can really spend that time and get that necessary stimulus that you're talking about, Chad. That's really different.
But see, even what you're describing, and you already perform at a high level, and you did this, it sounds almost more accidental or just kind of coincidental in line with the trip you were doing. So you said, hey, why not shape a camp around it?
Yeah.
It still smacks of what I see or how I feel in a general sense, is that you're icing a cake that isn't baked yet. It's you still got to cook that cake. I mean, you got to put it so that when you put the frosting on, I'm elaborating on the metaphor here, but there are so many other things that you need to get in line before you start worrying about things of this nature. And I'm not implying, Andrew, that you're not at that level. Maybe you are. Maybe you're looking for that last little bit of bump and you're willing to spend the money and maybe even do some camps, whatever. So maybe this does apply to you, but I don't think it applies to many of us.
The one thing that I can say, even in my position, Chad, is I feel like I have so much more work to gain in terms of raising my threshold. And at elevation, it's really tough to be able to do the sort of work that most productively does that. Right. So just to your point of getting the cart ahead of the horse, like I'm scraping for a fraction of a percent over here while I have this whole pool just of percentage points waiting for me.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. It almost seems in the case of you and people who are 5,000 feet plus, that it'd be more beneficial to go to a sea level camp for a little while. Right.
Would you agree with that too, Sophia?
Food for thought.
For you personally?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I really like about doing Tucson in the winter and then going into spring racing that's all at sea level is that my muscles are adjusted and adapted to that high level wattage. Like they'll see accelerations over 400 watts. But when I'm at altitude, I'm lucky if I get to 360, 350. So then, spending a bunch of time at elevation and then I go race at sea level. And then now my muscles have this massive workload that they're being exposed to that they haven't seen in a really, really long time. So although I can recover better because I have more oxygen, my muscles feel a little more sore just because the force that they're being exposed to is not something that they're currently used to. So I'm a big fan of, I live at, 6,000 feet. When I have big races coming up, it's, maybe go down to sea level a week and a half before just to get some exposure to those high watts,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great point.
Makes sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so another consideration, if you're on the fence concerning a tent, is that or even just altitude training in general, are that the gains are inconsistent and they're modest at best. And this all applies to elite athletes. Again, I didn't see too many studies that involve novice athletes. In fact, I can't really recall one that did. So this matters when you're at the elite level. Modest gains can be meaningful. So again, if that's where you are, this may be an appropriate direction to head. But again, for most of us, you got to ask, is my training already optimized? Is my genetic potential something I'm pushing up against? Because if it's not, again, cart before the horse. Mm-hmm. Add to this, and we've kind of touched on this already, Sofia V. Keegan, is there's very likely a genetic component of some level to your response to altitude. So you could do everything right, but the juice still may not be worth the squeeze, right? Get everything exactly as it should be, and you still don't see a measurable benefit. Maybe it's just, do you have a genetic predisposition that says, sorry. And then regarding the research, and this is just the research that I looked at, is some of the more encouraging findings may have flawed assessment techniques. So they used to use a technique called a blue dye technique. And then they found out that something to do with vasodilation, some of the dye can leak out, doesn't matter. The point was that a lot of these studies that use this technique may have overestimated their increases in things like red blood cell volume, hemoglobin mass, all those things that we're chasing. So now I think I know they use a technique called carbon monoxide rebreathing. And that may be just the way. I don't know, but I do know that older studies have been called into question because of certain limitations. So point here is that some of the most promising outcomes may actually be exaggerated. You read these figures and you think, well, geez, they got a 9% bump. If I got even a 2% bump, it'd be worthwhile. Well, they might not have gotten 9%. And then pretty obvious, but there are clinical problems that are associated with increases in altitude. Typically, those start at higher altitude, say, 2,500 meters, roughly 8,000, 8,200 feet. And those are situations that are certainly worrisome. We're talking cerebral and pulmonary edema. Those would be it. Those would be the main two, but they do see milder effects at lower altitude. So even as low as like 1,500 meters or 5,000 feet, again, where you guys live in Reno, Jonathan, But even then you can see these mild effects such as acute mountain sickness. And I'm sure you've heard of this and you think no big deal. Well, it kind of is, especially if you're trying to train, you've ascended to altitude and now you're basically dealing with a daily hangover to some degree. It's not favorable. So you kind of have to bank that, keep it in mind. Now, a little apart from the doom and gloom that I just presented, let's just look at, should you decide that you're going to pursue altitude adaptation, certain things to keep in mind. One is that iron supplementation can be really crucial to altitude adaptation. I mean, you're not going to get an increase in hemoglobin mass if you're iron deficient. It just doesn't work that way. So, Sophia, I think we talked about this. When you do any altitude work, do you actually supplement your iron?
I used to, and then I got some blood work done maybe like 4 years ago. And I had just gone from altitude to sea level. So I got tested in California and I was taking supplements and I cook with cast iron and my iron was through the roof. And my doctor was like really worried. She was like, you need to stop. So I'm not sure. I should probably go get retested because I'm not sure if that was so high because I had just come from a really big change in elevation or if my body just really took all the iron that it could. But I think, yeah, when you're supplementing with things like this, that too much could be really bad for you. It's really good to make sure that you're getting blood work done and getting that
that's
feedback.
absolutely true. And that's a very good point. So should you decide you are going to supplement with iron, I mean, small doses, probably not a big deal, probably emphasis, but a lot of these studies recommend pretty high doses in preparation for and exposure to altitude. And that's a bit of a gamble to just slam them in the system and hope for the best. So there's going to have to be some level of monitoring, right? And another point is that low training, when we talk about live high, train low, it doesn't have to be sea level. There were a number of studies that were done at heights as high as 1,250 meters, which is still 4,100 feet, which brings that effective oxygen concentration down about 3 ticks to 18%. Still really good results. So they were living high at I don't know how high, but they were living high and they were coming down to altitudes that weren't sea level at all, 4,000 feet above, still seeing good results. So don't think that if you're going to employ a live high, train low modality, that if you can't get down to sea level, it's a waste of time. And then finally, some authors strongly believe in altitude training periodization, that you periodize it like anything else, that you keep the training at altitude in line with the training that you're doing at sea level. And I think there's a lot to this. And I linked to, and as much as I'd like to dive into it, this has already become more bloated than I'd hoped. The paper it's a 2019 narrative review. Narrative reviews are pretty fun because they're really general and just a bit more readable. Inigo Sam, I don't know, it's Inigo Hika, guy, Avish Sharm, who I saw across a lot of these papers, and then Trent Stellingwerf. So if this is interesting to you, it's absolutely a paper to pore over. And then, so briefly, one of the questions was, what's the impact on sleep? And there do appear to be acute and chronic disruptions. So in the short term and the long term, and in both in terms of quantity and quality, and they both suffer initially, but it seems that quality stabilizes more quickly, but the quantity can take longer. And that's pretty general. And I don't know how useful that is, but there was some indication that stabilization of both of these things is more rapid with greater familiarity to altitude. So are you a native high dweller or a native low dweller? Because it's probably going to be easier for the high dweller to get better sleep more quickly. And then there's the matter of personal sensitivity to noise. I'm super sensitive to noise when I sleep. And if you're amongst that, you've got a motor humming along the whole night, or you're trying to, just any of those noises that could be disruptive, that's absolutely something worth considering. My 2 cents, and I think the research kind of backs this up, is that eventually you adjust to anything when it comes to sleep. I mean, you can live by a busy street. Initially, it's hard to get sleep, but over time, you learn to tune that out. I mean, soldiers can sleep under the most extreme of circumstances because they need to, and because over time they become desensitized to all those sounds. So I have to believe that would carry to something like this. So nothing I read said that sleep was a huge concern. Obviously, sleep quality is important, but none of these studies said, oh, and also you need to worry about your sleep quality. So I don't think it's high on the list of concerns when it comes to altitude training.
Chad, you and I have been up to altitude together, like high altitude, like up at Leadville for nights at a time. And we've commented on this very thing that every day you feel like sleep refills your cup less for a while. Like you just feel like, Oh, like first night, not great sleep. Next night, oof, even worse. And it's just, it's tough. Like it starts to really weigh heavy on you. For steamboat gravel, Sophia, what did you do? Because that's super high too. I mean, it's almost as high as Leadville, right? I think it was 8,000 or 9,000 feet.
I honestly have no idea. I decided to do that race. I think it was like a week before the event, and then ended up getting Katarina's Diverge Thursday night, and I was racing Saturday. So elevation was not my concern at all. Like I
Just
had
finding
other
a bike
things.
to ride.
Exactly. Just showing up, getting a bike fit. Definitely figured out I maybe should have been a size bigger. I think I run a 49 on my tarmac, but maybe on the Diverge, because of the future shock, I maybe should have gone to a 52. And yeah, altitude was not my concern there.
Yeah, because that's something that I've noticed, just that the sleep quality is so dramatically affected when I'm up at elevation for a while. And I've never been at elevation long enough where I feel like, okay, it's not getting worse anymore. It's like, I think the longest I've spent at true high elevation like that is probably 6 nights. And even on the 6th night, I remember just feeling like, get me out of here. Like, I can't wait to get to low elevation and get away from it. Chad, can I introduce or suggest another barrier that exists here? Potentially with doing this is cost, not only of the tents and all of that, but also, at least in the United States here, if you live in an area that's above 6,000 feet, chances are in most cases that it's something, unless you're in Colorado, something like a resort area. It's a ski resort town. It's something like that. And it is so expensive. Like everything just increases in cost, from groceries to gas to lodging to everything. It's more expensive in those areas. So that's another thing and it's actually kind of like a gripe of mine that I have with like putting a national championship up at high elevation, is like, not only is this physically a barrier to many, but it's also financially a barrier to so many, because how can you expect people to just increase their cost of living while they're already having to pay for the cost of traveling to the event and registering for the event and everything else? And then you have to increase that even more. I mean,
that's a really good point. It does seem really unfair to just put national and world level events at high altitude and expect everyone to just shoulder that cost.
Yeah, it's really expensive. Like I mean, man, if you think about it, living at elevation for 2 weeks to adapt or doing something like that, like a camp, that's a huge cost just in daily expenses that you would incur, you know. And they're beautiful places. They're great to be there. Don't get me wrong, but they have their cost, like very literally. So, yeah. So what else can we do if we can't do these things, Chad? Yeah, like, let's close this out. I can't tape the vents in my house. Like, I'm not going to do that. Yep.
So there are a couple of things, and some of them are easily accessible, some not so much. But the question was asked, and it merits answering. First off, there are several studies on what's termed classic altitude training, and this is really simply elite level athletes again, but this is going to carry to most athletes who live and train at modest altitudes. So the numbers seem to be focused around about 1,800 meters, 5,900 feet. So it's still high, but it's not ridiculously high. And they would see similar benefits because they were there all the time, lived and slept in it, trained in it, could train effectively, could administer the necessary doses. And I know, Sophia, you're in Park City for at least some of the time, and I think you live in Heber. So we're talking, you have the opportunity to train at 7,000 plus feet, and then you live at 5,600 feet. Kind of sounds very much along the lines of this classic altitude training, and it seems to work for you and Keegan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if anything, it's, my baseline of what my body currently is adjusted to is, that 5,500 feet of elevation. So because my body currently is adjusted to that, if I want to give it a little bit more, then I go up a little bit higher and train in Park City, or make sure I go climb a pass. So I just have to, everybody's baseline is different, and it's just like, how much more exposure can you get? That's not, a huge burden.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then another alternative is what's termed intermittent hypoxic exposure, or intermittent hypoxic training. The exposure seems to be if it's done during rest or passively, whereas the training is if it's done actively. And I saw studies ranging everywhere from 5-minute exposures up to 2-hour exposures. And they were usually done through use of some form of hypoxicator. And we've talked about tents and other forms of hypoxicators already, but basically you're just looking to reduce the oxygen concentration We'll get to masks in a minute, so I'm going to save that. But the idea is the same. As you're trying to stimulate the release of EPO, increase red blood cells, reticulocytes, hematocrit, all that, increase VO2 max, increase performance. And these things, there are studies that show good evidence of that this is a path worth considering. Equivocal findings, though, I got to say, some were hematological, some were endurance performance related, some were aerobic related, some were anaerobic related, and then a mixed bag of all those things. So I won't say that the science strongly supports this approach, but there are some studies that seem to say it's worthwhile. And then two more to wrap it up. I promise. One is wearables. So a mask system, hypoxicator, and these are not the intramuscular inspiratory muscle training devices. They're not those devices that make it hard for you to breathe, such that you're working your inspiratory muscles. These are devices that actually do affect the percentage of oxygen that makes it into your body. So a very different thing, but still challenging in their own right. They don't just solve the problem. You still have to wear them for so many hours a day, so many days per week, so many weeks on end. It's not just like, it doesn't change it all that much. And then finally, actual altitude camps. And now we're talking about real altitude. And this is that hypobaric hypoxia. So you got less pressure and you have less oxygen. And in this case, there's no simulation required. You don't have to burden yourself with a lot of these considerations. Simply go to there. Problem is, you got to train there. So you either have to have access to lower terrain, or you have to have supplemental oxygen. I mean, it's never tidy. So to wrap all this up, alternatives exist. Tents are affordable in your case, Andrew, but in the case of a lot of people, not so much. But all that aside, is this really where you should focus your resources?
That's a good question for all of us, for all the things that we spend our time or energy on to make ourselves faster. Like, is this the best spot for us to spend those resources? Looking at all of us spending way too much on, like, the next aerodynamic, we probably have a whole lot of opportunity to gain elsewhere. So
I think it's post deep dive, because I learned a lot, and that's a lot of information. I think, to go back to his questions, are there downsides to using an altitude tent consistently? Simple answer, like for me, it'd be necessarily not. Just be careful on your adaptation. You have to start, on a 1 week to a 2 week adaptation period. You can't go from sleeping at 1,000 feet to sleeping at 9,000 feet. You have to slowly adjust, and then just be aware that the workload you're able to do is way high, but your recovery is way low. So if you're going to be doing a heavy period where you're going to be sleeping, training at 1,000 feet, sleeping at 6, 7, 8, 9, just know that you probably should decrease that training load, just because you're actually not able to recover from it. Are there other things that you should be spending your money on? That's up to you on decide. Can you improve nutrition? Can you improve, equipment? Can you improve training plan? Can you add strength training? All of that stuff. Is sleep quality impacted? I think Chad said at first, yes, but it's something that you slowly get adapted to. And I've never slept in an altitude tent, but I've heard that they're better alone. Like, just because you're in this enclosed room, especially if you get the smaller one, like to have two people in there, that's a lot of body heat. So you probably need to be running the AC quite a bit. And then how much of a performance gain can be expected? I think that's all up to the individual and kind of the workload that you're doing. And other effects that we should be considering, I think it's, once again, up to each individual person. And, one of my favorite things to do at elevation, or at low elevations, to kind of get ready for a high elevation camp, is go do a 90-second max acceleration and then settle into 10 minutes of sweet spot. That sweet spot work is going to feel exactly like altitude is. So there's certain things that you can still do, to mimic what your legs are going to feel at elevation training at sea level.
That's an excellent point, because when we talk about blood saturation, if you just run that saturation down and then keep it at a level where it stays down, it seems like you would achieve the same effect, right?
Yeah. And those sets are so hard. When you start hard and then you roll sweet spot, that sweet spot just becomes increasingly more painful. It's impressive how hard it is, Also that along those lines, and this is a departure from altitude, but that's a great lesson for all of us about pacing. when we think like, oh, this surge at the very beginning doesn't do much, it's fine. It does. When you go out too hard, take it from me, a person that does it way too often, it absolutely can bite you. One other thing too, that I think it probably bears mentioning is when they're talking about other effects of using altitude tents, for those listening in Italy, they're considered to be illegal for athletes depending on the level at which you compete. And I think that there are probably other countries as well as Italy. If you're watching this now, let us know in the comments below on YouTube if you're aware of similar restrictions in other countries. But so that's also something to consider. That you might, that's why you wouldn't want to use some sort of a apparatus to be able to simulate altitude. Instead, you would have to rely on doing so naturally, just in a high altitude environment. So certainly something to consider. Let's just cover a couple more altitude things while we're on this, Chad. I think it's been fantastic. So don't be self-conscious about it. Yep. Brian says, for an altitude training strategy of training high and sleeping low, should all your training be at high altitude? And if not, what ratio of high altitude to low altitude should one do?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and something I honestly wasn't that aware of. When I first read that, I thought that Brian mistyped live high, train low. No, he means train high, sleep low. Train high, live low, or live low, train high is typically how they put it. So of course I dug into that topic, and I'm just going to touch on one study, which is a systematic review that encompassed 31 studies. And it's from 2014. They looked at 4 different methods of the live low, train high approach and its effect on performance in normoxia. Yes, this is team sport athletes, but it's still exercise adaptation, normoxia being normal oxygen. And so the 4 protocols, they had a continuous low intensity in hypoxia, interval training in hypoxia, repeated sprint training in hypoxia, and then resistance training hypoxia. And I'm just going to use their words. The findings were, the majority of studies reported no difference in normoxic performance between the hypoxic and normoxic training groups. And that's the majority of the studies. There were improvements that seemed to favor high intensity, short-term intermittent training. So based on this single review, it seems like high altitude training should be minimized in volume and lean toward high intensity.
I actually tried a protocol from, I'm sure, one of the studies included in this review this year, leading up to nationals. I went up to up above 8,000 feet. It was actually closer to 9,000 feet. And I was doing like 15 seconds on, and then basically, I think it was 30 seconds off, I believe was one of the protocols that they had. Repeated that, I think it was 10 or 11 times, and then full rest in between sets. And then I would do, I think it was 6 sets. I did that workout. It was absolutely miserable, by the way, doing it up at 9,000 feet. But I did that workout 6 times leading up to national championships because I didn't have a way to be able to spend time up at high elevation leading up to it. So I figured, well, I can, drive partially or just ride up there. And then after that, do my sets and then, rip some trail coming down. But so I looked into that same thing, and I have no way of being able to say if it actually helps. I don't know, but it's certainly uncomfortable doing that higher intensity thing. It's more like Sofia, I've heard this said before with training high, especially when athletes first get to elevation, that they try to keep the intensity low, right?
Yeah, you just can't. Your body needs time to adjust, and you can't expect to do the same workload. You have to take a certain percentage off your FTP, and now your tempo is your sweet spot and your threshold is more your zone 5, and you just have to take the time and adapt to it, and then you slowly get better, and your ability to repeat that power goes up. But it'll be nothing like when you go to sea level. Like, I know I feel like I'm on drugs or something, because I'm like, this is so easy. Like, it's like I feel like a powerhouse. And it's just all adaptation, and it all takes time. And it's also how much you let it affect it in your head. Because if you come in with it's just altitude, like I just know I'm going to hurt a little bit more, like you'll be fine. But then if you're scared of it and you're freaking out about it 3 weeks before your event, it's just going to mess you up, because you're going to be more focused on, oh my God, am I hurting because there's no oxygen, rather than what's, the race that's actually unfolding in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Jake's question, he says, I just bought my first mountain bike. And of course, that means I'm looking at races for 2022 and I'm leaning towards Breck Epic or maybe Breck Curious. I think he's just saying that he's curious about it, or is Breck Curious actually an event?
No, they do. You can sign up for the 6-day, or you can sign up for the first 3 or the last 3 days. So I think that's what Breck Curious is like. Nice. You do the first half or the second half, and you're not having to commit to the full 6-day experience. And it's half the price, I think.
It's actually Chad's idea from 2016. He came up with that mid-single track 6.
I did the day on, day off, which is kind of cool if you want to extend your stay. But I think this is probably a better solution because you can just make it a 3-day affair instead of a 6-day where 3 of those days you're doing a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah, Chad had this like a la carte almost approach where it was like, I'll just pay for 3 days of the stage race and decide where I want to place them within the stage race. I think it's a good idea. So he says, I've heard you all discuss timing one's arrival to a race at elevation a few times. It seems like arriving the night before or maybe a week or two before are the best strategies for a 1-day race. I imagine the option of arriving the day or night before for a stage race is not ideal because by day 3 of the race, one will be feeling the full effects of altitude. Is this true? And what would you all recommend for this? And then he also said, well, Nate sent an avid fan his altitude tent. Don't know. And then he also says, I recommend TrainerRoad to everyone. I'm loving adaptive training so far. 5 stars all around. Thanks from Jake. Thanks, Jake. We appreciate you recommending it. That's probably the most helpful thing you can do for us. So we appreciate that. What say you, Chad, to the timing issue with stage races?
Yeah, Jake, you pretty much nailed it. You're just talking about the timing of your exposure. And I linked to a study back in 2001 that noted that after the initial drop that they saw in blood saturation at altitude, they actually saw a slight increase over that first night. And I assume that carries to maybe the first day's performance. But during consecutive nights, blood saturation levels fell and then stayed at that, basically leveled off at a decreased level. So it is what it is. There isn't any new breaking science that says otherwise. So and it's a tough one to come up against, right? I mean, if it's a 1-day event, yeah, show up as close to it as you can, go do the event and go home. But if it's a stage race and you can't get there in advance of it, you're going to have to expect days 2, 3, 4, whatever they may be, aren't going to be optimal.
Yeah.
But in that sense too, it's also, okay, you can't show up early. Just know, maybe keep yourself in check day 1, day 2. Show up with a lot of fitness, because no matter if you're living at Breck and you're, ready to go, if you don't have high training load and, a high fitness, by day 3 or 4, you're going to be just as tired because it's a workload that you can't handle. Where the guy that just came from sea level, because, they've done a really good training block, they're super fit, their level of fatigue might actually be less, although they're impacted by their inability to be adapted to the high elevation. So not ideal, but just because it's not ideal doesn't mean that it won't work for you, or that it's, don't think about doing the event. And, are you wanting to win it? If you are, there's certain things you can do to prepare yourself better. But if you're just going to go out there for a 6-day adventure, like, who cares about the altitude? There's a stage you're probably going to have to walk up anyways, because they go up to Wheeler Pass. Like, it's, there's a lot of things if you're wanting to go there for a best performance, or if you're going there for an experience, and maybe you go 2022, you do Breck Curious, you kind of get the lay of the land, and then in 2023 you go back and go for a performance result for the full stage race.
Yeah, I've caught myself doing that very thing that you warned against there, Sofia, of thinking like, well, I can't get up there long before, so what's the point of even doing it? That shouldn't hold us back. Those of us that aren't paid to race, that are like, this is just a cool experience for us. That's really what it should be, right?
Well, you just have to manage the limitations like you'd manage them in any other circumstance. I mean, your fitness is a limit. You can't ride above that fitness. So if oxygen is a limit, then you have to manage that limitation. You can't just dive into it and expect to perform at the same level you would at sea level.
And it's also worth noting that in most cases, people are in the same boat as you. Yes, there are some that might be exceptional and might have been able to get up there with plenty of time or constantly live up there, but the majority of people are probably in a really similar boat. It's not as if you are, once again, we always have that fear that we're the only ones that are coming unprepared, or the only ones that are going to suffer uniquely, terribly, so to speak, from something. But chances are we're in good company with that. So Yeah, good advice with that. Okay, let's get into some rapid fire questions. What say you? So I went onto Instagram and asked for a lot of rapid fire questions, and we have a ton of them. So we're going to cover quite a few. But first, Chad, this one was absolutely for you, but you couldn't be on last week, and we need you to chime in. Actually, Sophia, I kind of want you to think about it in terms of chocolate, because I'm a chocolate nerd and you're a chocolate nerd as well. So, and Chad, you as well. You're also, all three of us are chocolate nerds here. So, okay. If the $3,000, this one's from Ryan. It's a great one. If the $3,000 tours, Giro, Tour, and Vuelta were wine, what sort of wine would they be? And then same question, but for coffee. So Chad, do you have, Keegan just completely ruined this, and he was like a Spanish wine, a French wine, an Italian wine. And I thought, this is like, come on,
pretty
man.
lazy.
Yeah,
it's pretty lazy
exactly.
for a guy who's willing to work so hard. That is not hard work.
Yeah. What do you think, Chad? You have a discerning palate and refined taste for this sort of thing.
First off, I'm super happy you recycled this question, because it's a very fun one. And if I had missed it, I would just be disappointed. Yeah. So I've got answers for both. And I thought I was going to have to give this a whole lot of thought, but really this all just came to the surface. I don't think I could have conjured this on the spot. So I am happy that I had just a couple minutes to think it over as Sofia scrambles for her chocolate answers. So with the Giro, it would be a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Zinfandel. Reason being is the Giro and these big wines are full of flavor, often surprising in their complexity, challenging and unpredictable. That just sums up the Giro. The Tour, it'd be a red blend or a table wine. It's dependable. It never disappoints, but it seldom impresses. Very few surprises, and it's often kind of forgettable. The Vuelta, bubbles, whether it's Cava, which seems appropriate considering it's Spanish, Prosecco or Champagne. I just want a sparkling white because it's fun, it's playful, it's exciting. It's a little bit out of the ordinary.
Wow. You and I feel exactly the same way about these Grand Tours. Like exactly the same. And people called me out for it. And they're like, yeah, exactly. Cause we're right. Yeah. People are like, how do you not like the Tour the most? I'm like, no, it's just, it's vanilla, it's there. It's always going to be what it is. But
no, and this actually extends to my coffees too. So the Giro, it would be an affogato, which it seems appropriate because it is a Spanish concoction, but it's rewarding on multiple levels, right? You got ice cream and espresso. Sorry. Yeah. And then for the Tour, black French press, high quality, be it, but that, because I could drink it every day, but some days it's just kind of boring. Okay. And then with the Vuelta, single origin light roast espresso, because if I had to drink it every day, I would look forward to it every day.
Ooh, I like it. Yeah. This Vuelta this year, so good. It's like, it's been fantastic.
Never disappoints. I love it.
It's always the best one. It always is. But people get Grand Tour fatigue after the tour. So,
not me. I just build toward the Vuelta.
Yeah, it's like the Giro's too early for people to get into it, and then they binge on the tour, and then they're like, I don't want to watch bike racing for another year, and then the Vuelta happens, and they miss out on all the best parts. Sophia, what do you think? And for those that don't know, a similar varied experience can be delivered through chocolate depending on the origin of the beans that are used and the processing and everything else. Can you find, I guess, like similar chocolates to the Grand Tours?
That's a good question, and it just depends on which way I would I think the Tour, because it's so grandiose and it's like this high event that's known around the world, I would think you would go for more of like a single batch, really limited edition. At Ritual, we've had some beans from Trinidad that we got the whole harvest from this one place. So it's super exclusive, kind of everybody looks forward to it, but hard to come by. I think, the Vuelta would be more of like single origin chocolates, because every year is a little bit different. And, you can try Madagascar from different years, and the notes will be a little bit different depending on what the climate happened that year. And then the Giro, I would think, would be more of like a crunchy inclusions, kind of, what fun stuff can you put on top? Because I think you kind of see what everybody's been working on this winter, and you just never know who's on form.
Good one. I like it. Yeah. My favorite, by the way, Madagascar from 2 years ago was really good. And then, but as of late, it's been Peruvian bar is just amazing, at least from the recent harvest. So Anyways, yeah, we've talked a lot about chocolate. Ritual Chocolate's probably getting orders like crazy, and we are not capitalizing on that. Okay, the next one that we'll cover is this one. It says, imagine if you are a pro roadie, what grand tour would you least want to do, and what would you most want to do? If you have then he also says, if you have mountain bikers or cyclocross racers on the podcast, same thing with World Cup XC or CX. So we have on the, which one would you least do or at least like to do in terms of grand tours for all of us?
Well, the women only have one, so
yeah, very, very pertinent point. yeah
Giro.
Only the tour. Yeah, only the Giro. The tour is, are they going to have one
next
year? I heard whisperings again that they're going to do. Hopefully they do it.
They say, we'll see.
yeah hopefully they do. Chad, which one would you like to do most or like to do least?
Least would probably be the Giro, because I've ridden those roads and the climbs are extreme, and I'm just getting bigger as I age. So muscle, mind you, but no, the fact is I'm heavier and I go uphill slower, and those climbs are unforgiving, beautiful and super fun to experience. But I think I would more enjoy, even though everything I said kind of sounds counter to this, would be the Tour de France, because the climbs are just a bit gentler. I haven't experienced France, but I have experienced all those big climbs, and man, what I love to do with Tourmalet, Alpe d'Huez, Hautacam, all that stuff.
Yeah. Sophia, can you pretend as if they actually did have women's versions? Which ones would you do? You're such a good climber, but then you're also really good in like flat stuff too. So
yeah, I'm an all-arounder that skews a little bit to the climbing. But like even yesterday I did some like max 10-second things, and they were some of my best I've ever done. So it's like, it's really interesting. I don't know. I'd rather be on dirt for sure.
Well, what about World Cups then? Is there a World Cup that you look forward to most, or one that you look forward to least?
I think the one that we all look forward to the most is Novo Mesto Novo Mare in the Czech Republic, just because the climbs are the hardest, the descents are the hardest, and the fans are the best. So I think that one has the most weight to it out of all. And then when I look forward to the least, I finally got introduced to Alpstadt, and that was quite a shocker of how hard that race is.
Yeah. I feel like for me, absolutely the Vuelta would be the one I would want to do the most. Not saying that I would excel on the absolutely brutal climbs they have, but I love it. I love it a lot. The Giro would be the one that I would not want to do because it seems too cold. I know that sounds, it's just, it always looks so freezing. Those poor riders, they're always just completely frozen. And for mountain bike stuff with World Cups, the Val di Sole course that they had at Worlds looked so awesome. That looked like my favorite course I've seen. I have no clue because they look really different on TV, I'm sure, than they are in reality. But that one looks really great. And Mont Saint Anne is always one that I've always looked forward to a lot. The one that I would probably not be into is actually the one that Sophia said was probably the best one. It was just Novo Mesto. For me, it doesn't look that one doesn't do it for me. So, and Albstadt too. That looks like a terrible way to go. Okay. We're going to Instagram. I'm pulling out the phone. We have a lot of great ones. Okay. You can buy one carb source at a convenience store and to complete the ride and for the whole entire ride. Which one is it?
Oreos.
Man, it's probably not the best call, but Reese's peanut butter cups, just because if I have to eat it the whole time, that's the only thing that's going to taste good to me the whole time. I'm
probably going to I'll do coconut crumb donuts, the little cool. Debbie sleeve. That's the one I'll do. Yeah. If I can't do that, strangely, I'd probably pick Lay's potato chips, like not flavored, just the normal potato chips. It's carbohydrates and salt. I probably have something. Oh yeah, I can't have anything else in the bottle. So maybe that would be weird. Too much salt. Usually I crave those on a ride because I'm having too much sugar. Right. But yeah, that's what I would do. Okay. Let's go. You all sent through so many. This one, very important. Sock, shoe, or sock, shoe. Sock, shoe.
Sock, shoe.
Yeah. What sort of psycho does sock, shoe?
Seriously.
Well, also,
there's a potential to end up with just one sock and shoe on.
No, but who has their socks and their shoes in the same place either? Like I keep my bike shoes in the garage and my socks are in my room. So no.
Yeah, no, I couldn't do that. If you're a sock shoe person, no judgment, let yourself be known so that we can understand that this actually exists, because I don't think it does. Okay, let's see. There are a lot of questions that you sent in that were not rapid fire questions, by the way, that were like very detailed ones, but just the same, rapid fire only. Okay. Some of these are fantastic. Okay. The week leading up to the race, would you rather have no work for a week or no kids for a week? Yikes. I'm probably the only one that can answer this practically. However, theoretically, all of us can. I would pick no work. Having kids can be such a boon. Like, I love hanging out with my son, and it's like a lift. If they're really young, could be hard, but that's what I would stand. Work is very stressful sometimes. So you guys feel the same?
No comment. I'd
Probably.
kids.
No kids. Okay. Forgive me. Yes. Let's see. What is one thing you did in cycling that you swore by at one point, but now no longer do? Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know the opposite. I swore I never would race over 100 miles, and now I'm racing gravel races that are 140 miles.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, look at you. Yeah, doing long stuff.
Yeah, but nothing the other way.
Okay, so one that I have, I have a lot of them. Usually, like, I'm always against things and Nate's for them, and then I eventually pick them and Nate just grins, and he loves the fact that I came to it later than him. He's very big on that, on many things, not just cycling things. But when I had first started cycling, I was so huge on the necessity of having electrolyte in my bottles and electrolyte focused bottles. And boy, have I completely jumped off that train. I still have electrolytes in there, but that's if you were to rank it in importance compared to carbohydrate intake, electrolytes would be 1 out of 10, where carbs would be 10 out of 10. It's easy to get in those electrolytes, super easy. And there's no point in wasting a whole bottle on that when it could be, making it premium versus you could get jet fuel in that bottle with a bunch of carbs. So that's one thing. I don't think that it's not that I don't think electrolytes are crucial, but I just value them, relatively speaking, way less than I used to. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up Nate, because he does shine a light on those things often, where initially you want to make fun of him, and then eventually you come around to the fact that, damn, he was right the whole time. And dropper posts are that thing, because it wasn't hard to convince me that a dropper post on a mountain bike would be a good thing, though I was on the fence for quite some time. Then he put one on the cross bike, which I thought was totally ridiculous, turned out to be amazing. And then he always talks about putting them on road bikes. And again, absolutely. They've banned the super tuck. You want to do a super tuck, get a dropper post. You're in a super tuck position. Yeah. Not to mention how much it affects handling and confidence and all those other things that go with it.
Yeah, I'm all for it. If they're putting lead fishing weights and bottom brackets, I think they have some weight to work with anyway.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So
they're already at a deficit.
Yeah. So if they're already there, why not change it? I think it'd be easy. Favorite ice cream?
Mint chocolate chip. Sorry.
Just normal chocolate chip or mint chocolate chip?
Mint chocolate chip. But the one that's homemade, where the mint, the ice cream isn't green, that it's white.
Oh yeah.
And you just mix actual mint into it?
Well, I think it's when it's a small batch artisan mint chocolate chip ice cream. It's not actually green. I don't know how they do it, but those are always so good.
I've never had this. That sounds really good.
Oh no, it's very good. Peanut butter chocolate, and you can't mess it up. Even the cheapest brands somehow do it well.
Mine's coconut flavored ice cream. I know that sounds weird, but that's my absolute favorite. It was something that I got down in Latin America. It was they didn't really have vanilla in Chile. They had coconut, and I just got used to it. And oh my goodness, I love it. Coconut ice cream is my favorite flavor. It's boring, but it's my favorite.
That reminds me, 4 or 5 years ago, my teammate that now passed away, Ben Sontag, he came to stay with us for Point to Point, and we were all big on get ice cream before the race. So he's in charge of getting ice cream, and he comes back with coconut and pistachio. And I'm like, dude, these aren't even ice creams. What are you doing? He's like, these are the best things ever. What do you mean? This guy loves this.
Pistachios right up there is one of my favorites too. Oh man.
Yeah, I'm like, isn't it supposed to like include like candy? Like, don't you get froyo for the toppings, not actually the froyo flavor? I don't know. It cracked me up though. So I always think of him when I see pistachio and coconut ice cream.
Yeah. There's another one that's coming from, if Shimano and SRAM and Campagnolo were car companies, what would they be?
I'm going to pass on this because I think a car is just good enough to get you from point A to point B. I don't really care what it is.
Also, you're sponsored by companies. So yeah, don't, you don't have to chime in here.
Well, and I don't even own a car.
Really upset.
Yeah, I don't even own a car. So I just pass.
There we go. Chad, what say you?
SRAM would have to be Audi because they're just the best cars.
Yeah.
Shimano would have to be something Japanese and awesome, but just not my taste. And then Campy would be something awful in Italian, probably a Fiat maybe. I just never been a fan.
Not even
of
high class.
I was going to say Campagnolo would be like Alfa Romeo or something like that, where
that's kind.
It seems it's fancy on the front, like in appearance, but in reality, it's just, it's a normal vehicle these days, at least.
Like overpriced, like a Jaguar, like those have such high society value, but it's more name than anything else.
SRAM's absolutely Audi to me, as well as Chad. And I'm going to get a lot of people upset about this, but come at me. Dura Ace is GM. They're the most boring thing.
Oh, he's going to go with Ford.
There we go. They're General Motors. There's no appeal. They don't change. They do the same thing over and over. Yeah.
But it works all the time.
That's true. It works.
Reliable.
All the time.
Yep, it does.
100% reliable.
That's it. Yep. Okay. And we'll just do one more, and then we're going to go into a couple of the live questions. So if you're joining us live, throw those in here and we'll be able to cover those. Okay. One person is asking a question that I do want to get to for them. It's a rapid fire question, but it's not the silly kind, really. It says Lotoja nutrition prior to race day. That race is coming up, and a lot of you have been asking questions about it because a lot of you do that race. It's a huge race. You take in a huge amount of carbohydrate. That's it. Stay low on fiber. And you want to take something that doesn't upset your stomach. And so stay away from vegetables and, excessive things like wheat, that sort of stuff. This is your time to be able to just kind of eat unhealthy, but to pack in those carbohydrates.
Yeah, this is interestingly timed because my knee-jerk reaction would be to carbo load. It's a big event. It's a long day. You're going to, if any situation necessitates carbo loading, it would be something like that. But people aren't going to ride that at a high intensity. So I read a fresh perspective pretty recently that had me questioning, whether or not carbo loading makes sense for low intensity events. I mean, definitely address your carbohydrate intake prior to, but this whole 10 to 12 grams per kilo sort of stuff the day of or the day prior seems a bit excessive if you're only ever going to be working at 50 to 60% of what you can do, because I feel like you can stay on top of your carbohydrate intake by eating all the garbage you want to eat, but don't allow yourself to eat on race day by hitting those aid stations, because you're simply not blowing through it as fast as you would if you were racing it.
I think that most people too, with even an event like that, they ride way over 50 to 60% in the beginning in particular, most people. Yeah. And then they get to the point where they kind of reside down. So I think that they can drain their stores pretty quickly. If you were measured, then you wouldn't be going above 50, 60%, right? Because it's such a long event. And in that case, it could make sense. And
I
also
still see that as a deficit you could get on top of, but yep. I would have to back this up with actions rather than just sit here and theorize.
Most important part too is that no matter what you eat beforehand, that does not replace the need to fuel properly on the bike. Like you can't just think that, since I ate a bunch beforehand, I can just, I'm fine with that with skipping this aid station. Like, no, you need to hit you need to dot all those I's, cross those T's. Okay. Kea, she has a question. She says, I want to get some off-road stuff, but not sure where to start. Looks like the starting point for dual suspension hardtails can be a little more expensive than buying a rugged alloy road bike, which you can swap thicker tires into. I want a bike that can do it all. When my road bike, she mentions the Scott Addict RC, is having a break from the perfect conditions. So actually, like, what say you to this one, Sophia? Because you've been racing full suspension, hardtail, and you've been racing a gravel bike, and you've also raced state championships on a road bike this year. You've done like a bunch of different stuff on all the bikes. What would you recommend for Kea in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you already have a road bike, even though there's the price point of a rugged alloy roadie that you can swap thick tires to, like, it's only going to increase your capability of where you're going to be able to go just marginally. I think, if you really want to improve your skills off-road, a full suspension mountain bike, especially now the more progressive ones that have 120 millimeters of travel in the front, are going to be more forgiving and help you get into more places. But I think really the hardtail is really the most versatile setup. You have a little bit of suspension, you can fit a really big chainring. The girl that won the Dirty Kansas XL, she actually had a hardtail and she put drop bars on it, and she kept her suspension fork. So she had it all set up to go race gravel, but she still had the aerodynamics of having drop bars and not being so upfront. And yeah, with a hardtail, you can really go anywhere. You can ride single track, fire road, technical trails. If you put a dropper post on there, your options even get bigger. So I think if you want to get into more off-road, go with a bike that's going to allow you to go more places. I think the rugged alloyed roadie frame would expand your capabilities just ever so slightly, but at the end of the day, you're going to get on it and say, I should just be riding my road bike here.
This makes you think of your good friend Sarah Sturm too. She did incredibly well at Leadville on alloy hardtail from Specialized. So Kea mentioned the cost, and yeah, like, if you get a full suspension bike, it can be really expensive, but I think she rode the Specialized Chisel, and there are other brands that have similar like hardtails with modern geometry. So they're going to handle really well, but they're alloy, and like Specialized is very good at using alloy to build bikes in particular, that it's getting a bike that's still comfortable and not abusive, and not too flexy. BMC has one too. I think it's called the 2-stroke AL. You can get that one. That's another great choice. And I'm surprised Cannondale doesn't make one. Maybe they do, and I'm unaware, but those can be great choices. I think that I agree. The hardtail is a really good choice. Really good choice. So, okay, let's get into some other ones.
Wait, don't I get to answer that one?
Oh, Chad. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Only because I have a refreshed perspective, because I used to, for a while there, I looked at my bike collection and was overwhelmed by it, and so much maintenance, so many different tires, so many different cog sets, wheel sizes. And I tried to whittle it down, consolidating similar bikes into one bike, so now my Criterium bike also has wide tire capability, so it can race all the way up through gravel and so on. And, hardtail was where I landed for a mountain bike, because it can do all the things and still work somewhat on the road or hard pack trails, whatever. I've completely given up. And it's largely because my financial situation over time has changed to, I am in the very fortunate position of being able to buy a bike every year without having to sell the previous bike. So my collection only grows and becomes a bit more granular as I do it. And my satisfaction is on the same trajectory upward. Every ride has a very particular bike, and it's more enjoyable because of it. So I recognize this is not a situation a lot of people get to appreciate. I am happy that I am amongst the fortunate few who get to. But if you find yourself in this position, just keep buying bikes. You won't regret it.
Yeah, no doubt. Some people collect sports cars. Chad collects bicycles. So not a bad thing to do. Next one, I am not even going to try to pronounce the name, because I will do you either disrespect, or you're trying to get me to say something that I shouldn't say on the internet and get banned for or something. So I won't try. But you say, how does one deal with post-race blues or post-race high? Let's say you nailed a training plan and your race, then it hits you. What's next? I felt that a few days ago. So this is a really good, and this listener's from Brunei, which is super cool. Good to have people all over the world. So do you deal with this, Sophia? It's maybe it's more complex because it's your job too. Like I don't even know.
I mean, the perfect example is the Olympics. I think I have dedicated my life, the majority of my life since was wrapping up college, 4 years, ended up being 5 because of COVID, into going from a Cat 1 racer to an Olympian. Made it to the Olympics. The experience wasn't what I thought. There was like, we weren't in the main village. There was COVID. So like family wasn't going to be there. I didn't have all the support that I needed. It was very rushed. And now I'm like, okay, I've achieved my goal of competing at the Olympics. What's next? Like, I applied for the Canyon SRAM Women's Continental program because they're looking at girls from like Asia and South America. I'm like, maybe I'll go race road and gravel, or like, do I want to focus more on endurance stuff? Like, I think the one thing that sucks about having these goals and just everything so focused on one thing is that once you get there, regardless of your ability to execute or not on the goal that you had set, then you're like, okay, what's next? Like, becoming an Olympian was like, okay, I'm an Olympian now. Like, it doesn't change who I am, what I do. It's just something I get to put on a resume. So I definitely feel that. And I think that's why it's good to have long-term goals that keep going outside of competitions. And I think for me, it really helps that I just enjoy showing up every day to training and seeing what my body's capable of and how far I can take something that I never imagined was even within my capabilities. And then, just having different things that you're looking forward to that aren't all so sports related, for sure.
Yeah. Chad, you've done a ton of racing over the years, and you've evolved from being like a person that was doing it at a young age, very young age, of mountain biking as a kid, all the way to, to the point of racing masters, and then getting to the point where you aren't as motivated by racing anymore. Have you dealt with the post-race blues and highs like this?
Yeah, I have. I'd really like to not follow Sofia talking about the Olympics, but if we can scale it down to, what I think most people deal with, it did go through that very winning phase where it was exciting, and one win led to a desire to win more. But then it did hit that tipping point where you start to recognize that winning doesn't bring me the same satisfaction it was. Whether or not it's happening in the, well, it's got to be happening in the brain, but it just became of less relevance and less motivating. And it was also accompanied by the realization that there's always the next new thing, the next new rider. There's going to be that next person who's better than you, who you can't touch. Your period of time is finite. You're not always going to be winning. I just came up against realizations that made it feel, I won't say pointless, because there was a lot of satisfaction to be derived out of racing, riding bikes, training, interacting with people, a lot of positives to it, but it did start to seem kind of hollow, I guess. It just, the satisfaction at some point waned, and I couldn't recapture it.
And now for you, the bike is something different, though. Like
you mentioned, just plain fun. I mean, being saddled with injuries right now is more frustrating than it's ever been in my life, because I have so many good places to ride. My network of people to ride with is growing. I have all these fun bikes. I have parts that are finally arriving so that I can finish bikes that are in certain phases of completion. And I can't do anything. So just be patient.
I don't, I have to be honest, this one, I've never experienced the post-race blues before. Maybe it's because, I don't know, the process of building Tour de Race is pretty exhausting for me. And the race itself is very exhausting. I think I dump probably too much of myself, but all of myself into the race. And when the race is over, I don't dread the race leading up to it. I'm excited for it, but there's also a lot of relief after a race is over, because I felt like, oh, we did it. Like we did all of that energy I had building up from months and months and months, it's there, and I did it. And then I really try to give myself time to just, not have any sort of requirement whatsoever thereafter that, whether that's a week, whether that's longer, whatever it might be, a few days, it just varies, but never have. I can only imagine this very much exists for a lot of us athletes that are listening to this, that pick very big events like Ironman athletes. You dump a huge amount of capital into just the entry fee. And then probably traveling somewhere, and the bike, run, and swim equipment, and all the time that you put in, and balancing all of those three, I can absolutely understand how that would be present there for sure. So especially with all you athletes, I'm so sorry to hear that Kona was delayed again. It's got to be really tough to hold on to it, but don't give up and be process oriented. Like Sofia said, go out and see what you can surprise yourself with today. And that can really help. It can change the process from feeling like drudgery based on an extended timeline with no ETA to something that, hey, another opportunity to learn something new about myself today. So it's the way to do it. Sofia, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, you help so much, particularly with the elevation talk as well, just because you have such great context to be able to offer with that. You're awesome. How can people find you and follow you, get in touch with you?
Instagram is the platform that I am the most active on. Obviously, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, but I really just check Instagram, and I'll let Jonathan link it instead of describing my Twitter handle.
We'll link it down below. If you're listening, it's Sofia the Villa, so SOFITHEVILLA, and you can find her on there as well. Open book, and she's ready to answer any questions that you have. You can find us on there too. Chad doesn't log into Instagram very often, but Easter egg, you can probably find him if you search for his name. So maybe when we do a Beers with Chad again at some point, he'll come out of Instagram retirement. So thanks a bunch, everybody, for joining us. And once again, submit your questions at TrainerRoad.com/podcast. Go try adaptive training. Go to TrainerRoad.com/AT and share this podcast with all your friends. Submit those rapid fire questions on Instagram, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, everybody.